All right, we're recording now. So I'm going to handle this just like we normally would, which is I'll give some keywords throughout the video, and it's only you right now. But for you, when we're done, you can just email me and give me those keywords. And of course, this is recording, so then anybody who watches this can email me and give me the keywords. And speaking of which, Anthony, if you feel like you need to step away from the computer, or you need to quit, or you need to quit and come back, do whatever you need to do. I'll sit here and talk to myself if I need to. It's recording, so don't feel like you're stuck here. You can leave whenever you want, and if you're concerned about the extra points, you can just watch the video once I post it. So, and speaking of the points, since this is not mandatory at all, and this is material that won't even be on the exam. Instead of being worth 2.4 points, it'll be worth twice that, so 4.8 points. And that'll either be applied to your absences if you have them, or towards your independent work. So, any questions before we get started? All right, let's jump back into it then. Let's see here. All right, so you can see my slide, right? The PowerPoint?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, we're still talking about trophic structure. And remember, the two basic ways to look at a trophic structure are the food chain and the food web. And it's basically just, you're looking again from the producers, which are photosynthetic organisms that, incorporate that sunlight energy and incorporate all, and then build organic molecules out of inorganic molecules, and everything else is based off of that, right? All the energy and all the matter in your body eventually, or at one point, came from a producer. Remember, and all that energy came from the sun ultimately. But anyway, under the topic of trophic structure, let's talk about biological magnification. This is something we discuss in more detail in Bio 108, the environmental biology course, but we'll scratch the surface here. Organisms cannot metabolize many toxins. What that means is a lot of times when a toxin comes into an organism's body, they can't break it down. So it just stays there. Not only can they not break it down, but they also can't get rid of it. So some organisms, as they ingest different toxins, it just stays there, right? It remains in the body. And as you might imagine, as they accumulate more of it, it becomes more concentrated. You know what I mean? Like, so if you had some little organism out there filter eating in the ocean, it might at first be 1 part per billion might be, I don't know, lead. But then as it keeps eating from the same area, eventually it accumulates more. So then it's 2 parts per billion, and then it's 4 parts per billion, and then it's 8, right? So it becomes, first of all, magnified within its own body, but that's not even what we're getting at when we talk about biological magnification. What we're talking about is how it magnifies as you go up the food chain. And if there was a question on that on the exam, or that's what it would be about the term, what does biological magnification means? But again, this won't be on the exam. So let me give you some examples from the book here. And this is a real life example. This is nothing hypothetical. This is something that really happens. So here you have the zooplankton, which is basically, it's not unicellular animals, but it's close to it, right? These are really, really, really small creatures. Mm-hmm. And they're basically filter feeders. They filter stuff basically out of the water, and that's what they get for nutrients, right? That's how they eat, if you want to call it that. And because of that, they have a little bit, they also ingest some of the toxins that are in the environment. So even if there's just a little bit of toxins in the environment, they're picking them up a little bit. And again, because it doesn't leave their body, it stays there. So generally speaking, in this specific example, you would have 1 nanogram of whichever toxin it is, and PCBs. And you learned about PCBs in that video, Poisoned Waters. But anyway, so these zooplankton on average have about 1 nanogram of PCB per gram of body tissue. So anyway, cod eat these zooplankton. So yeah, there's a little bit of PCBs in those zooplankton, but the cods are eating them up, right? They're eating as many as they can. So therefore, it gets more concentrated. So cods have 10 nanograms of PCB per gram of body weight. And then salmon eat the cods, right? So salmon are eating up a bunch of cods as much as they can, and the cods are more concentrated than the zooplankton. Therefore, the salmon are even higher concentrated, 90 nanograms of toxin per gram of weight. And then, of course, humans at the top of the food chain here, we eat salmon, and we eat more than one, right? Generally speaking, we eat a bunch of seafood. Therefore, you could have 350 nanograms of PCB per gram of human weight, which is a lot. And the reason they're using human breast milk is I don't know if you know anything about how pregnancy works. Well, I don't know if you know this particular aspect about pregnancy, but there's certain foods that pregnant women should not eat, and this is one of them. And this is the reason why. They shouldn't eat certain fish, because fish are basically at the top, close to the top of the food chain. Therefore, they have a high concentration of different toxins. And in this case, in this example, it's PCBs, but there's also other toxins out there. So any questions about that?
No.
All right. Let's talk about food webs, even though I've already kind of hinted at it. I like talking about food webs more than food chains, because food chains are just, the most simple representation of how things work that you can provide. Food webs are a step up. They're a little bit more complicated. They're a little bit more realistic and less simplistic. Because in all actuality, in real life, there are very few communities that are so simple that they're characterized by an unbranched food chain. Meaning, you're not going to go out and find, a piece of land that has one species of grass that's being eaten by one species of, grasshopper, that's being eaten by one species of bird, which is then eaten by one species of snakes, right? It's not that simple. So a more realistic representation is something we call food webs. And food webs also introduce something called omnivores, which we haven't discussed yet. And I'm sure you're familiar with the word. An omnivore is something that eats producers and consumers, right? So it just makes things a little bit more complicated / a little bit more realistic. So here's an example from your book. We're still looking at producers and primary consumers and secondary consumers and tertiary consumers, quaternary consumers, so on and so forth. But it's no longer just this one simple unbranched chain from the bottom to the top. Here you can see, and also before I get into this, we should also point out or look at the fact that even this is, even though it's more complicated than the food chain we looked at, this is still a simplified version of what nature is really like. But anyway, that being said, here you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different species of plants. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different species of things. 5 different, no, 6 different species of things eating the plants. And then you have species of things that eat those. And you can see it's very complicated, right? There's different species that eat more than one species, and it becomes very entangled, if you will, the tangled web. And that is important. And I don't remember if your book points this out or not, but this is another reason that biodiversity is so important. So you can imagine, let's say for some reason this mouse looking thing went extinct. That is going to be a little bit of an issue, right? Because that bird eats it and this snake eats it. I think that might be it. So yeah, those 2 things would be affected, but this bird also eats other things, and this snake also eats other things. So the point being here is the more pieces you have in the puzzle, the better off you are, right? Because if you lose one species, hopefully everything will be okay because you have many more. Obviously, the fewer species you have in this mix, the worse, because, obviously if you lose one species and that's the only species that another species eats, then in all actuality, you've lost 2 species. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, yep, that's a food web. We'll move forward. That's it for trophic structure. So let's now talk about species diversity. And we've already talked about biodiversity. If you remember way back when up here, we talked about species diversity, right? Now we're talking about it again. But instead of just saying species diversity is, the different amount of species you have in a community. Now we're going to get a little bit more specific and talk about ways you can actually measure species diversity. Again, even though we already mentioned this earlier, your book brings it up again. Species diversity, which is the variety of species, Species diversity is the variety of species in a community, and it consists of two things. So here's the new information. It consists of species richness and relative abundance. These two things are different but related. Species richness is the one that we basically be talking about. It's the most simple way of looking at things. It is the number of different species. And if you remember the discussion we had when we first brought up species diversity, the example I was giving was the people in the classroom where I was giving the lecture. I was saying the number of species in this room is one, right? There's one, so the species richness would be one. And then if somebody brought in their pet dog, then the species richness would be two, because you'd have a dog and a human. And then if someone else brought in a cat, you have three, right? Dog, human, cat. So anyway, that's species richness. You understand that? It's just the number of species that are there. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Then you have something called relative abundance, and that is the proportional representation of each species. So again, using that example of people bringing in their pets into the classroom, if you had, a human who brought in their cat, and a human that brought in a dog, and a human that brought in their lizard, and a human that brought in their bird, and a human that brought in their turtle, right? Each human brought in one different pet. That would be a pretty high relative abundance, right? Because each human would have, for each human, there would be one other new species, right? So it'd be pretty good biodiversity. Now that would be completely different than if you had, I don't know, everybody in WVSU goes into the auditorium, right? So you have thousands of humans in one room, and then you bring in one cat, one dog, one turtle, one lizard, whatever. It would still be the same species richness, right? You're still bringing in one of each of those things I listed, but you would have so many more humans than you did those other things that you wouldn't have a good relative abundance. And here's a better example. This is the book example that you can read about. They use forests. So here we're looking at woodland A versus woodland B. And if you look at woodland A, we've got hold on, excuse me. Let's do it like this. We have 1, 2, 3. I'm seeing 4 different species here. That's woodland A. Woodland B, again, 1, 2, 3. That looks weird. And 4 species. So we're still dealing with the same number of species, but woodland B has more biodiversity because, as you can see, woodland A is mostly these, oak-looking trees, these hardwoods, right? Meanwhile, woodland B is a good mixture of all those 4 species. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, those are the 2 different ways of looking at species diversity. And then there's just a graph of what I just showed you. So you saw the different trees, and there's a graph comparing woodland A to woodland B. All right, now there's a new topic that we need to talk about, and that is something called a keystone species. So this kind of goes back, kind of like a caveat to what I said earlier. When I was talking about that food web, and I was talking about species diversities, and I was saying, it's the more species you have, the better, because it's all one big tangled web. And if you lose one species, then it won't be as big of a deal if you have a bunch of other species, because, if you have one species that some other species is eating, well, if you lose it, maybe that other species could eat a different species, right? That's the normal situation. However, the caveat to that is this thing called a keystone species. And a keystone species is a species whose impact is much larger than the total mass or abundance indicates. Your book gives a good example, and rather than read it, I'll just show you and talk about it. So here we go. And I don't think this picture's from your book, but the sea otter here, that is a keystone species. And there's not that many of them in this situation because it's a top predator. It's up there, maybe a tertiary or quaternary predator. It's up there, so there's fewer of them in number. And you can see, here's a simplified version of its ecosystem. You've got some kelp here. You've got some sea urchin. What they don't show you too, there's probably some fish that can only live here in the kelp, right? Because that's where they hide. Maybe that's where they get their food. So what happens here is these sea otters eat these sea urchins. That's their main source of food. But what happens is if you lose the sea otters, then you also get an overabundance of sea urchin. But sea urchins eat kelp. So what happens is the sea urchins since they no longer have a predator around, they explode, the population explodes. So they start eating all the kelp dies. And then all those other species, right, all those other fish that used to hide and lay their eggs and eat the kelp, they no longer have that. So they're gone. And then all those fish that eat those fish, they no longer have anything to eat. So they're gone. So that's a great example of a keystone species. Yeah, it's just one species, but it has a very important cascading effect, if you will. So if you take away the sea otter in this example, you basically destroy the whole ecosystem. So yeah, that's a keystone species. And there's that's just a graph. Your book, I also used an example of a starfish, and I don't remember exactly how they did it, but basically they looked at two different ecosystems, one of which had a starfish, and you can see the diversity of critters in there with the starfish. And of course, here on the right, you can see without the starfish, there are far fewer species. So any questions about that?
No.
All right, pretty simple stuff. Now we're going to move on to a completely different topic. I mean, we're still looking at community ecology, but we're going to look at something called disturbances and succession. First thing you would need to know if this was going to be on the exam is what a disturbance is. And a disturbance is an episode that damages communities, at least temporarily, destroying organisms and altering the availability of resources. So just think of like just think in your mind of any ecosystem there is, whether it be the woods, across the street from Hamlin Hall, or I don't know, the wetlands next to the beach you might go to, right? An episode will be something that came in and basically just changed it drastically. Your book gives some examples: storms, fires, floods, droughts, a mini ice age. That would be that would be pretty long term. So it might go beyond disturbances. Disturbances are kind of like a temporary thing. That's another thing to keep in mind. Yes, they change things, but they change them temporarily. So I guess an ice age would be a bad example. I'm glad I said that, because that would be a more permanent change, right? That would just completely change the ecosystem. But anyway, small scale natural disturbances have actually a positive effect on biological communities. So it might seem weird because you might think, well, storms destroy things, fires destroy things, floods destroy things, droughts destroy things. And this is all true. But if they're small scale and if they're not long lasting, they actually do have a positive impact. And your book gives an example of a large tree falling in a windstorm. And let's talk about that. So you can imagine what this looked like before that tree fell. It probably just looked like any typical forest. Well, they could probably came up with a better version than this, because you can see grass here. But imagine if this was actually in a forest. At the forest floor, you generally don't see grass growing because, generally speaking, you have the canopy of the forest, so there's not a lot of light hitting the ground. So generally speaking, on the forest floor, you'll have plants that don't require much light, like moss and ferns, right? And that would be it. But here, when this tree falls, that completely changes things up. So even though you only had maybe mosses and ferns on the ground, now that whole thing fell, there's now this huge opening in the canopy. So now all this sunlight is coming down and hitting what used to be in the shade. So now you have all these new species that weren't good in the shade but are good in sunlight. They're popping up, right? So those are coming in. They're new. You can see all this soil is now uprooted. So I'm sure there's different kinds of plants that would prefer this kind of soil than the topsoil, right? And if you look really closely, you can see that this thing also left a little crater that is filled in with water. And that's a whole new ecosystem. So now you probably have things like frogs laying their tadpoles in there, maybe some turtles. You have a new watering hole for mammals. This too, you could have hiding places for mammals. The point is, when this tree fell over because of a windstorm, because of the disturbance, now all of a sudden you have all these new little microhabitats that can, and new niches, right, that can be opened up for different species, and that would increase the biodiversity. So hope that makes sense. Are there any questions about how disturbances can be beneficial?
No.
All right. Your book points out that humans are the most significant the most significant agent of ecological disturbances. And if this was going to be on the exam, that would definitely be a question, but it's not, so we don't have to worry about it. But yeah, that is something to keep in mind. Nature causes disturbances, volcanoes, things like that, tornadoes, hurricanes, typhoons. But these days, it is humans who do the most damage. And one consequence, there's many of them that we talk about in my other class, but one consequence of humans causing disturbances is the emergence of previously unknown diseases. And what a great bullet point this is. This was written before COVID-19 came out, but this is what we're living in right now. The prevailing hypothesis right now, I think, is that the virus that causes COVID-19 came from a wet market in China. And a wet market is basically where they sell, a bunch of live wild animals to be consumed. And probably what happened then was that there was a virus that used to be only in a specific animal species, perhaps a bat, and it mutated, and it was then able to also infect humans. And because the humans have those bats and other things at this wet market, then that disease, rather than being out in the wild and never contacting humans, was then able to contact humans. And here we are in the middle of a pandemic. So what a great example this bullet point is. But anyway, going back to what's written on the screen, 3/4 of emerging diseases have jumped from humans or to humans from other species. And that would be a question I might ask you too on the exam if this was on there, but it's not. That's an important number. That's a large majority. And now that we're going through a pandemic and I've seen a bunch of people who are uninformed about biology, I realize even more how important this is, because I have a Facebook acquaintance who says, he's convinced that the government has done this. This is all on purpose. And I'm not even going to get into that. But part of his evidence is the fact that, again, the prevailing hypothesis is that it came from another species and jumped into humans. And he posts things sometimes like, well, diseases just don't do that. They just don't jump from animals, other animals to humans. But they do, right? So regardless of what you think about the origins of COVID-19, what I'm getting at here is that it is very common for diseases to go from other animals to humans. And obviously when we humans encroach on their habitats, it's going to become more prevalent. It'll happen more often. So anyway, any questions about that?
No, sir.
All right. Pretty simple stuff, but important. Again, I had no idea how many people didn't know this. So they thought that was some kind of new thing that this virus perhaps jumped from bats to humans. That's not new. It happens all the time. Swine flu, bird flu, HIV, list goes on and on. Anyway, so that's it for disturbances, sort of. So let's talk about what happens after a disturbance. And that would be ecological succession. And if you are familiar, you might be familiar with the word succession outside of the context of biology.
Yes.
Like what do you think of when you think of succession outside of biology?
To leave and not be a part of.
Right. And when I think of the word secession, when I'm not thinking about biology, I actually think of politics, because in secession in politics, what that means, if the president dies, then the vice president steps up. And if the vice president dies, I think it's the Speaker of the House, right? And there's a whole list of who steps up and in what order. So when you think of secession, you should think of a particular order that things are stepping up, so to speak.
Okay.
So communities change drastically following a severe disturbance. So, the example I gave earlier was a tree falling down. That wasn't necessarily a severe disturbance. So there was a drastic change in the community in that little area. But generally speaking, that forest is probably the same, other than that one small area. But if it was a severe disturbance, then it would be a drastic change. And what do I mean by severe disturbance? I mean something that would perhaps strip away vegetation and soil. Like a really, really bad flood, or perhaps a nuclear explosion, or maybe, a rock slide. So we used to have this area that was, we could go on and on. I don't have time. But yeah, just think about something where there used to be vegetation and soil, and it was just prime for, things to grow there and survive there. If you have a disturbance big enough, you could strip all that away, and you're basically starting new. So what happens, or excuse me, let me also say this because your book didn't. This doesn't necessarily have to start from a disturbance. This could also be a situation in which there's just new land. So think about like if you had, there's the ocean, try to draw an ocean, and under the water, it's an underwater volcano, right? And every time it erupts, it gets a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger, right? The lava keeps adding up, and then eventually that thing is above the water. So now all of a sudden you have a new island, but the only thing that's on it is volcanic rock, right? So there is no soil. There is nothing living on there, as far as plants or soil or anything like animals are concerned. So it's just a rock. That would also be another situation in which you would have ecological succession. Or one last example, you've got glaciers. Glaciers are usually, miles thick of ice, and below that is nothing but rock because nothing lives there for the most part. So once the glaciers melt away, excuse me, then you're left with nothing but rocks, right? There's no soil, there's no plants. So anyway, when these things happen, either when you have new land or there was a severe disturbance, we have something called ecological succession. And that is when that area is colonized by a variety of species, gradually replaced by succession of other species. Meaning, think about like looking, I don't know where you live, what you can see, but when I'm looking out my window right now, I'm seeing some sycamore trees. I see some myrtle trees. I'm seeing trees, big trees. Now, if I were to try to grow one of those big trees on a piece of rock, that wouldn't work, right? Because trees need so much soil. They need all kinds of stuff that just wouldn't happen on a piece of rock. Right. So what happens is there's a very specific order in which the species come back. So first, it would probably be species like moss and lichen, right? Things that don't need a lot of soil. And that would happen for a long time until eventually they all died and decomposed until, you had a good layer of soil. And then you could have some small plants that require just a little bit of soil. And then they would die and add to the soil layer, so on and so forth. I wish I could talk about it more, but here's a good example. Again, this lava flow went over. At that point, everything died. So what you're seeing here, these plants that are living in the lava soil, this is not what was left over after the lava flowed. This is what happened after the lava flowed and everything died. And then we have this thing called primary succession. So that is the first step in succession, because obviously it's a bunch of succession. And primary succession is when we have it in virtually lifeless areas with no soil. So again, prior to this picture being taken, that was nothing but rock, right? That was nothing but lava that had turned to rock. So there was no soil, there was nothing. That would be primary succession. Meanwhile, again, I'm looking out my window. You can't see it, but if something were to happen and someone came down and, cut down all my trees, that would not be primary succession because, all the trees are gone, but there's also that huge layer of soil and perhaps plants that are already growing, like ferns and moss, things like that. So any questions about what primary succession is?
No.
All right. Secondary succession. That's just the next one. So that's what I just described when I was talking about my forest. So if somebody cut down all my trees, or if there was a fire and all my trees were burnt down, that would just be secondary succession because there's still some soil left, right? So we're not starting over with secondary succession. We're starting, that comes after primary succession. So pretty simple stuff there. Any questions about that?
No, sir.
All right, let's jump into ecosystem ecology. So to remind you, the first thing we started talking about in chapter 19 was population ecology. And remember, when we're talking about a population, we're only considering how that one species is interacting with themselves, right? And how that one species is growing or how that one species is declining. That's a population. And then in this chapter, I introduced you to communities. And to remind you, when we're talking about a community, it's the same as a population, except now instead of looking at one species, you're looking at all the different species and how they're interacting. And now finally we get to the next step, which is ecosystems. And ecosystems are basically communities, but instead of just looking at how all the different species are interacting with each other, we're still considering that, but now we're also considering how they are interacting with non-living things. So let's jump into it. and this is basically what I said, but now you can see it in writing. An ecosystem includes the community of species. So again, all those living things, those biotic factors and how they interact with each other, in addition to the non-living things, that's tough, abiotic factors. Oh, that is hard to do like this. Anyway, you get the picture. The abiotic factors, the things that are not living but are still dictate how an ecosystem is going to function. The energy, right? How much sun is it getting? Is it getting full sun, partial sun? Is it in a holler where it's most of the day it's in the shade, but at one point of the day it's getting light? Is it on the top of the mountain where it's getting full light? All those things. Soil characteristics, is it rocky? Is it sandy? Is it more like clay? Is it really thick in nutrients, or is it not? Does it have a high pH? Does it have a low pH? Water, same thing here, right? Are we talking about, is it in the desert or is it in a swamp, right? Or anywhere in between. So obviously all this should make a difference. Just think about the road you drive down. The plants living right. I'll come back to that. But yeah, so when we're talking about an ecosystem, we're talking about a community, but we're also considering how these non-living things factor into the community. Like I would bet if you were to look at WVSU's campus, I would assume you would find more squirrels farther away, towards the football field than you would towards Hamblin Hall, because Hamblin Hall is closer towards the main highway and the interstate. And that would be an abiotic factor, right? Those noises would probably scare, to some degree, the squirrels, and they would probably avoid those noises. But anyway, I don't necessarily like this slide, but your book included this information, so did I. So let's talk about what a terrarium is. It's basically like an ecosystem that's sealed off. It's like a little man-made ecosystem. Here's a picture of one, or a drawing of one. So there it is, a terrarium. It's like an aquarium, but instead of being in the water, it's got land stuff, right? So you've got soil, you've got plants, you've got some air. Basically, again, it's like a little self-contained ecosystem. Now, terrariums in and of itself, that's not an important concept for this course. What is important is what terrariums demonstrate. And you can see here that this is sealed off, right? So there's no oxygen coming, there's no gas coming in, there's no gas exiting, there's no nutrients coming in, there's no nutrients exiting. Everything in here is stuck in here, right? Someone made this whenever they made it. They sealed it off, and that's it. There's no more water coming in. There's no water leaving. That's it. It is sealed off from the rest of the world forever. And what this demonstrates is that the only thing that comes in and that leaves that box is energy, right? You have energy coming in the form of light, whether it be the sun or grow lamps, whatever it may be. Energy comes in, and as you learned in chapters 6 and 7, that energy is used in photosynthesis to build glucose and other molecules, and then that glucose and other molecules is eaten by animals, and then the animals break it down in respiration, and in that process they're releasing energy. And in that case, as you hopefully you remember, and that might be on the final, most of it is actually lost as heat energy, right? Most of the time, most of metabolism, when you break down stuff, most of that energy is not put to direct use to make ATP. Most of it is actually lost as heat energy. So again, energy comes in and it leaves. That's the only thing entering and exiting this ecosystem. The rest of the stuff is recycled. The water is recycled. The nutrients are recycled. The nitrogen, the carbon, the oxygen, all that stuff we learned about earlier in the semester, all that stuff is recycled because, again, this thing has been sealed off. So anyway, if this were on the exam, the key focus that I was getting at here, let me back up, is these two things here. And we even said this in chapter 1, and I said that we'll talk about this way later in the semester. So here it is. And again, energy flows through an ecosystem, right? It comes in and it exits. It doesn't stay there. I mean, it might be there temporarily because, again, each molecule of this plant temporarily is storing energy. But anyway, ultimately, it flows through it. And ultimately, it is the matter. It is the chemicals that are recycled. So any questions about that?
No, sir.
All right. Yeah, that's basically what I already said. With that concept in mind, let's talk about energy flow and ecosystems. As you already know from chapter 1 and from exam 2, the whole thing was we talked about how all organisms require energy. That is one of the properties of life. That is what we devoted ourselves to for chapters 5, 6, and 7. So if we were to take a closer look at the energy flow through an ecosystem, we might ask ourselves, why are there so few top-level carnivores? And I mentioned that earlier today. I kind of hinted at that fact where there's plenty of producers, but not very many top-level carnivores. Another question you might ask yourself is, how can we apply energy flow concepts to the use of our resources efficiently? So basically what I'm saying here is, for this bullet point, we're going to kind of look at nature and see how things work. And then with that knowledge in mind, we're going to kind of look at how humans do things and how can we apply what we know about nature to help us as humans. So here we go. The first thing we're talking about is primary production. And you're already familiar with this because we've talked about it throughout the semester. I've just never talked about it in this context or used that word primary production. So here's some information that you would need to know to fully understand primary production, but these are numbers that wouldn't even be important on the exam if we were taking it. This would be more, this kind of detail would be saved for my other course. But your book points out that Earth gets about 10 to the 19th kilocalories of solar energy per day. That's a lot. I wish I had time to talk about it. You could look it up if you want. That's a whole lot of energy. Most of that energy is absorbed, scattered, or reflected by the atmosphere or the surface. What do I mean by absorbed? Think about the examples I was giving when we were talking about pigments. If you're wearing a black shirt, your shirt's absorbing those photons. That excites the electrons in the pigment of your shirt. That excitement is then lost, remember, and then that energy is then put off as heat, and that's what makes you hot, right? So when I say absorbed, a lot of that is what I mean. Obviously, scattered and reflected, that just makes sense. Sometimes, or whatever you see, like if you look at a green plant, remember, that means all the light is being reflected. All the light is being absorbed other than the color green, which has been reflected. But anyway, the point is, most of it is not put to use, but some of it is. Of all the light that actually reaches autotrophs, remember those are the photosynthetic organisms, the primary producers, of all the light that actually hits them, about 1% of that is converted to chemical energy by photosynthesis. All this to say, in a nutshell, Earth gets a lot of energy from the sun, and only a small fraction of it is actually being put to use. Here's some other words you might need to know, or you would have needed to know. There's something called biomass. That is the amount of living organic material in an ecosystem. So a good example of that was just in your mind, picture an acre in the desert, like some really bad, like barren desert too, right? Maybe one cactus, right? And you don't see any other living thing. And then in your mind, picture an acre of rainforest. The acre of rainforest has a lot more biomass. Just think about all those huge trees and all those smaller plants and vines and all the animals that are living on that acre, right? There's a lot more living stuff in that acre. That's the one word you would need to know. Another word you would need to know is primary production. And that is the rate that producers convert solar energy to chemical energy that is stored in biomass. So again, in your mind, using the same example I used earlier, if you were to, in your brain, picture a desert versus picturing a rainforest, you can imagine that there's a lot more solar energy being converted in the rainforest because there's so many more plants doing that than in the desert, right? And that's just one example. But scientists have actually quantified it. So if we're talking about primary production around the Earth, it yields about 165 billion tons of biomass per year. So that's a big number. I would assume that number is getting lower and lower every year as we keep cutting down trees, but that's a whole different discussion. As I've already hinted at, different ecosystems vary, right? So again, a rainforest is going to have a lot more primary producers, therefore a lot more primary production than a desert would, for example. And your book actually gives you some examples. And if maybe in my other course, you might even need to know this. Like I might ask you, what would have more primary production, a tropical rainforest or a tundra, right? And hopefully you would remember, it's a tropical rainforest has much more. A tundra, as far as we're concerned, is basically a desert, but it's freezing. So as you can imagine, there's not much primary production going along there. So any questions so far?
No.
All right. So now that we know about primary production, let's talk about ecological pyramids. And we've already kind of hinted at this as well. I showed you an ecological pyramid earlier when we were talking about food chains and food webs, but now I'm going to officially introduce you to the concept. As you already know, energy flows through an ecosystem, right? That's the one thing that flows through it. It doesn't stay. Ultimately, it comes and ultimately it leaves. But how does it flow through an ecosystem? It's not like there's wires, right? It's not like electric energy. Remember from chapters 5, 6, and 7 that in organisms, in biology, when we talk about energy, we're talking about the energy that is stored in chemical bonds, right? So this energy is flowing as organic matter, meaning these plants use solar energy to produce glucose. And then these herbivores eat those plants and get that glucose and chemical energy. And then they use that energy to build their own, to go through respiration, but also to build their own body molecules. And then those things eat the herbivores and so on and so forth. The important concept here is that every time you go from one step to the next, like here we go from primary producer to primary consumer, every time you go up, much energy is lost in each step. And your book gives an example here. For most ecosystems, you start with an herbivore that eats only a part of the plant, right? So again, imagine in your brain, just picture some ecosystem with a bunch of plants, right? So that is energy that that's the solar energy that the plants have turned into chemical energy, right? Every molecule that makes up those plants, that's stored energy. But herbivores don't come in and eat every single living plant, right? They only eat parts of the plant. They usually don't even eat a whole plant. So there we go. That's the first step, right? We went from plant to primary producer, and we've already left out a bunch of energy, right? We left a lot of energy on the plate, so to speak. And not only do they only eat parts of it, but they can't even digest everything they consume, right? So some of the stuff they just poop out. Therefore, that's still matter, right? Those are still molecules. So those molecules still contain energy. So there's some wasted energy that didn't make it from one level to the next. Specifically, your book talks about caterpillars. You got this caterpillar, and it gives some numbers here. Let's say a caterpillar is feeding on a leaf, and it passes about half of that energy as feces, right? So it kept half, it pooped out the other half. Now, of that half that it kept, 35% of that was used just for cellular respiration, right? Just to make ATP, just to live. Doesn't say anything about building itself or growing. That's just what it takes to live. And then, again, of the half of the energy that it didn't poop out, about 15% of that is actually transformed into caterpillar biomass. And this goes back to chapters 2 when I was talking about building molecules. It takes energy to build molecules, and this is where that energy comes from. So again, every molecule that makes up that caterpillar is basically a battery, right? It's stored energy. And again, only about 15% of the energy that caterpillar ate and didn't poop out, only about 15% of that is actually used to build its biomass. And finally, it is only the biomass and the energy it contains that is available to the consumer, right? The consumers aren't benefiting from the 35% that was lost in cellular respiration. The consumers are not eating the poop, right? So that's wasted. So it's only a small amount that makes it to the next level, and that's the important thing. And then your book gives this graphic to give specific numbers instead of percentages. If this thing's eating 100 kilocalories, then 50% of it, or 50 kilocalories, is gone to poop. 15 kilocalories were actually used to grow, and that's what's going to be used. That's what's going to be eaten by whatever eats it. And then, of course, 35 kilocalories is essentially lost to cellular respiration. Whew. Sorry, I'm trying to go quick because this is not on the exam, and I know you probably don't want to sit here all day on a Friday. But anyway, this brings us to an energy pyramid, brings us back to the energy pyramid. And an energy pyramid illustrates energy loss as you go up each step of the food chain. So it's a good visualization of how much energy you started with versus how much is lost for each chain. Each tier represents all organisms at a specific trophic level. So like all the producers, all the primary consumers, all the secondary consumers, and the width of each of the tiers indicates how much energy is available. And again, your book gets pretty specific here. And it's a reminder here, about 1% of the sunlight that is available for primary production, of that 1%, only about 10% of that energy is available from one trophic level to the next. And if this was going to be on the exam, that would definitely be a number you need to know. That's a very important concept. Every time you step up, you're going to lose. You're only 10% of all your energy is moving forward. And let's just talk about what I mean by that. So here we go. If there's 1 million kilocalories of sunlight, as you can see down here at the bottom. Let me get my pointer. Excuse me. Come on. Yeah, you see it?
Yes.
Anyway, yeah, if there's 100 kilocalories of sunlight, then only 10,000 of that is actually going to be incorporated into the plant biomass, right, through photosynthesis. And of that, only 1,000 kilocalories is going to be, put into the primary consumers. And of that, there'll only be 100 kilocalories available for the secondary consumers and 10 kilocalories for the tertiary consumers, so on and so forth. And this, to bring you back to that earlier slide, this is why we don't have usually very many top-level predators, and also why you very rarely get past tertiary consumers, much less quaternary consumers, because there's just not enough energy to support that, because the higher you go, the less energy is available.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, basically this is what I was saying, but it's in writing. The energy available to the top-level consumers is very small compared to the energy available to the lower-level consumers. So we humans, being top-level consumers, we have much less energy, biologically speaking, available to us than a grasshopper would. Because of that, and let's get away from humans as an example, because this is not necessarily true in our case, but because of that, top-level consumers require a lot of geographic territory, right? Because they have they have a very small amount of energy available to them, so they have to eat a lot of different other animals. Therefore, they need a lot of space to get all that food. Any questions?
No, sir.
All right. So that being said, let's talk about the same thing, but in the context of humans. So the dynamics of energy flow applies to humans just as any other organisms. And the two production pyramids that I'm going to show you in the upcoming slides are based on the same model I just showed you, except again, now we're going to look at it from the context of humans instead of just nature in general. And this is another good example of why vegetarians are better for the environment than meat eaters, because vegetarians, you can see this one, let's just say hypothetically, this is, 10 acres of land. I'm just making a number up. Let's just say that's 10 acres of land to grow that corn. And that 10 acres of land can, support that many humans. However, if you were to take the same 10 acres of land and then have cows eat the corn and then have humans eat those cows, then the same 10 acres of land could only support the one human as opposed to all that many. So those are just numbers I was throwing out there. Those numbers aren't exact. The only thing that does stand, if you want to get exact, would be, again, only about 10% makes it here, and then only about 10% makes it here. So, again, each step you go up, you lose 90% of your energy. And, again, this is why technically vegetarians, at least from this aspect, are better for the environment than or thinking about the lab you had, vegetarians have a smaller ecological footprint than meat eaters, because again, this one piece of land, which is the same as this, supports this many humans as opposed to one. Now imagine if each one of these humans was a meat eater, so then each one of them would need that much land. So anyway, any questions about that?
No.
All right, pretty simple stuff here. Whew. Let's talk about chemical cycling and ecosystems. And again, this is stuff I go into great detail on my other class, Bio 108. So I'm just going to go through this very, very quickly. We've already mentioned this. You already know it. I've already said it even in this lecture. Chemicals have to be recycled, right? Energy flows in and out. Even, I showed you that picture of a terrarium, but you could think of Earth as a giant terrarium. Energy comes in from the sun, and it actually is lost as heat. We lose heat energy to space. But anyway, energy comes in and out. Chemicals, molecules, matter, all that stuff. that stuff is recycled. There's a picture that's a good representation of that. There's a dead tree right there. You can see it's dying, it's decomposing. Meanwhile, you have this new tree growing on top of it. It is taking advantage of that decomposing tree. It is taking those nutrients and putting them back to use because, again, nutrients are recycled. Matter is recycled. So instead of just saying nutrients and matter are recycled, what we're going to do in this section of the chapter is specifically tell you how carbon is recycled and how phosphorus is recycled and how nitrogen is recycled. But before we get specific and tell you how that happens, first we're going to do like a general overview of how stuff itself is recycled, and then we'll get into the specifics. How is stuff recycled in general? First of all, the first thing you should keep in mind is this is in the abiotic and the biotic sphere. So a living thing has a bunch of matter, right? You could look at a human. Remember, we learned about that. A human is what? The big four: carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, right? We learned that. So yeah, that makes sense. We all know that living things are made up of matter, but then also non-living things like rocks, right? Rocks have a lot of phosphorus, for example, or the air. The air isn't living, but that's mostly nitrogen. Anyway, so what happens is these things go back and forth. They go between living things and non-living things. And you've already been introduced to this when we learned about photosynthesis and respiration, right? Carbon comes into living things when plants turn it into their material. And then plants or animals eat that, break it down, and then release that carbon back into the atmosphere. That would be a cycle, right? When you're going from the living to the non-living.
Right.
So because of that, because they cycle back and forth, that means sometimes they are in the living, like I just said, and there's a word for that. That would be the biotic reservoir. So you are a biotic reservoir. And then there's the abiotic reservoir. So every time you breathe out, you are breathing out carbon from all that glucose that your cells have broken down. And at that point, you are then putting the carbon back into the abiotic reservoir. Pretty simple stuff. And here's just a general scheme of how most of them work without being specific. Again, you're going from the abiotic reservoir to the biotic right here. So the geological process, well, I won't even get into that. Who cares about the general one? Let's talk about the specific ones. Again, the three big ones we're going to look at are carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen. There's a bunch of other ones, but those are the big ones we're going to talk about. Carbon, I just talked about, and we learned about it in chapters 6 and 7. So I'm going to go through that one really quickly. The carbon cycle. Carbon has an atmospheric reservoir. So when we're talking about abiotic reservoirs, remember, again, they're broken down into biotic or abiotic. Now, if we're talking about abiotic reservoirs, those themselves have subcategories. So for the case of carbon, the biggest abiotic reservoir for carbon would be the atmosphere. I hope that makes sense. You just think carbon and non-living things. Yeah, it's mostly in the air. Other abiotic reservoirs include fossil fuels, right? So you have gas, oil, things like that. That would be, again, abiotic. Yeah, pretty simple stuff. As you already know, carbon cycles between the biotic and the abiotic reservoirs almost entirely by photosynthesis and respiration. We already talked about how that happens. You breathe in, you eat carbon dioxide, you eat carbon, you break it down, you release it every time you breathe out, and then it goes back to the abiotic reservoir. If you download this PowerPoint, you can watch that video. Here's a little picture of everything you already said. Again, there's carbon dioxide is the big, the atmosphere is the big abiotic reservoir. So carbon is released in the atmosphere both by animals breathing or even by plants doing respiration or, as we mentioned earlier, burning fossil fuels. So it's in the atmosphere. Then plants go through photosynthesis and take it out of the atmosphere. Pretty simple stuff. Any questions about that?
No.
All right. Let's talk about the phosphorus cycle. This one's new. It's simple, but we haven't talked about it before yet, or we haven't talked about it yet. The first thing to note is that the phosphorus cycle has no atmospheric component, so you can't breathe in phosphorus. We cannot get phosphorus from the atmosphere. Basically, the only place we can get phosphorus is from rocks. And if you remember, phosphorus is important because what is ATP made of? Adenosine triphosphate. So we know right away that we would not have life without phosphorus. And we also know what is the backbone of DNA? sugar phosphate backbone. So again, without the phosphorus, there is no life on Earth. So that's why phosphorus is important. So phosphates move from land to water faster than they're replaced, meaning, with just normal weathering, what happens is we get phosphates off of rock, right? When it dissolves and it goes from the abiotic to the biotic. That happens quickly. What doesn't happen quickly is it going from the biotic back to the abiotic. Yeah, I've already talked about why phosphorus is important. Another reason it's important that your book points out is that phosphate is a limiting factor in many terrestrial ecosystems, meaning if you're looking at plants growing, right, usually they have plenty of water, usually they have plenty of sunshine, usually they have plenty of carbon dioxide, all the stuff that you need, they usually have. The one thing they don't usually have enough of is the phosphate. And to remind you, that's what a limiting factor is. So imagine you had a factory that made chocolate chip cookies, and you just have tons and tons of sugar and tons of flour and just literally tons of chocolate chips. But the only thing you get is one stick of butter every day. Butter would be your limiting factor, right? You have more than you can eat of the other ingredients, but you only get one stick of butter every day. That's your limiting factor. So in plants, phosphate is often the limiting factor, or at least one of them, which is why fertilizers usually contain phosphates. Anyway, there's a picture that shows you how it works. I'm not going to talk about it in too much detail. Again, phosphorus is found in rocks. So what happens is it gets weathered, it seeps into the ecosystem, and then from there, plants are able to put it into their biomass, and then animals eat that, and that's how we get it. Blah, 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 blah. Any questions about the phosphorus cycle?
No.
All right, nitrogen cycle. This one's a little bit more difficult. I find it interesting. Again, we keep talking about the reservoirs, right? That seems to be a common theme. In this case, the nitrogen reservoir, the abiotic reservoir anyway, is the atmosphere and the soil. So remember, carbon was almost entirely in the soil, right? The atmosphere. That's where you find most carbon. Most phosphorus, again, mostly found in rocks. Nitrogen, mostly found in the air and in the soil. Specifically, every time you breathe in, you are mostly breathing in nitrogen gas. Into 80% of what you breathe in is nitrogen gas. However, you certainly can't use nitrogen gas. It's not like you breathe in nitrogen and your body's like, oh, hell yeah, that's what I needed. I'm going to use that nitrogen to make some amino acids and then use that to make some proteins, right? It would be nice if we could, but we can't. Neither can plants. So even though we need nitrogen for all the reasons we mentioned throughout the semester, we just can't get it out of the atmosphere, even though the atmosphere is over about 80% nitrogen gas, right? So we have a problem, but we also have a solution, and that is called nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is simply the process that takes nitrogen from the atmosphere and converting it to a form that we can use and the plants can use and that other living organisms can use. So again, to get it from the abiotic reservoir to the biotic reservoir, we have to go through nitrogen fixation. It's that simple. Your book actually gets pretty specific and tells you, yes, technically you're going from N2 gas to ammonia, which is NH3. And then that ammonia gains a hydrogen proton, and that then becomes NH4 plus. I'm not worried about that, right? What the important thing for you at this level of biology to know is that to get the nitrogen that we all need to survive, to get it out of the atmosphere and into the biotic reservoir, we need nitrogen fixation. How does that happen? Usually it's bacteria. There's bacteria that do that. Your book gets specific and tells you that, yes, usually they live symbiotically with the roots of plants, which makes sense because it's the plants that are doing this, right? Animals aren't doing it. It's the plants that need the nitrogen so they can build the organic materials that we then eat, and that's how we get it. And here's a picture of it. I'm really not going to go through this because I want to save you some time. But again, look at it when you get a chance. You can just see things cycling. So again, the big take-home message here is we have all this nitrogen in the atmosphere, and we have bacteria that take it out of the atmosphere and change it into a form that the biotic reservoir could use. And then on the flip side of that, we have something that does the opposite, denitrifying bacteria. So we have all this nitrogen in the soil, in the biotic reservoir, but then there's these bacteria that say, nah, get it out of here. And then they convert it into the gas, and the circle of life continues. Any questions about that?
No.
Yay. Moving right along. Your book also wants to point out that humans have disrupted the nitrogen cycle, because nitrogen is also one of those limiting factors for plants. So we need nitrogen. We need it for plants. We need it for fertilizer. Also, people like to blow stuff up. So we also like to make explosives with nitrogen, like TNT, toluate. Anyway, your book points out that two major sources of nitrogen, at least from humans, are the combustion of fossil fuels. So when we burn stuff, we put out nitrogen, which is not good because we're putting out too much of it. And like I already hinted at earlier, agricultural practices. So when we use fertilizers, we're putting nitrogen into the system. And normally that sounds like a good thing because things need nitrogen. But as I've been hinting at throughout the semester, there's the dose makes the poison, right? So even though ecosystems need nitrogen, too much of it's a bad thing. And that's basically what we're getting at. And that brings us to something called nutrient pollution. And you're already familiar with this because you've already watched the poisoned waters video. And that was the first portion of it when they were talking about the chicken poop. Here we go. Nutrient pollution. Woo! Going quick. I'm running out of breath. The growth of algae is limited by low nutrient levels. Like I already mentioned earlier, phosphorus and nitrogen, right? That's the big thing for photosynthetic organisms. That's usually their limiting factor. That is their stick of butter that they're not getting enough of. So what happens with nutrient pollution? That happens when you get a bunch of that stuff that they need. And then therefore, these things that normally grew slowly grow abundantly, which sounds good at first. Common sense would say, hey, that's a good thing, right? These things are photosynthetic. They take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That's a good thing. But it's not necessarily a good thing. Let's talk about why. Well, here's a picture of it. First of all, it just looks nasty. But there's a more important reason than simple aesthetics. First thing we're talking about is phosphate pollution. That comes from fertilizers. It comes from the runoff of animal waste, again, like you learned from the chicken farms in that video. It also comes from us, sewage treatment plants containing phosphates, not just from our poop, but also from things like dishwasher detergents, laundry detergents, stuff like that. So anyway, obviously it's a problem. Obviously humans are the cause of it. And phosphate pollution of lakes and rivers results in the heavy growth of algae and cyanobacteria. And again, that might sound good because common sense tells you photosynthetic organisms are a good thing. But again, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. Anyway, let's talk about nitrogen pollution. Similar situation. A lot of it comes from fertilizers. So what happens is, people put fertilizers on crops, lawns, golf courses, yada, yada, yada. Not all of it is used. Most of it is washed out when it rains. So it's rushed into the rivers, which eventually makes its way to the ocean and to the Chesapeake Bay, as you learned in the video, and the Gulf of Mexico, as the book gives the example of. So you can see even people way over here in this part of America, they're just like, hey, I'd like to have a green lawn. They put down fertilizer. It rains. It makes it to that river, whatever that is, which makes it to that river, which makes it to the Mississippi, which brings it to the Gulf, which kills a lot of stuff. So there you are living in Oklahoma or whatever, just trying to maintain your lawn, but you're actually killing stuff down in the Gulf of Mexico. Any questions about that?
No.
We're doing good. Let's talk about the last main bullet point, conservation and restoration biology. And we already hinted at this in the last chapter, and this is a lot of common sense stuff that you've probably been familiarized with your whole life, so I can go through it quickly. Obviously, many environmental problems are caused by humans, almost all of them. Most things that happen in nature are natural and they are fine. Like a disturbance, a small disturbance, as we learned earlier today, is a good thing. It's humans that are messing things up. Therefore, there are ecological research foundations that are used for finding solutions to these problems that we cause and also reversing the negative consequences. So here we're trying to fix the problems that we have, avoid the problems that we have, and also fix the damage we've done. And I use this picture because I don't know if you remember I don't remember when it was, 2014, 16, somewhere. We had that chemical spill in the Canal Valley and we couldn't drink our water. But
Yes.
yeah. Anyway, that brings us to two terms that you should know. Not necessarily for the exam, obviously, but conservation biology is the one term. That is the goal-oriented science that is seeking to understand and counter the loss of biodiversity. So conservation biology is like, all right, we've got to take care of the biodiversity. It's basically that simple. And then you have restoration ecology. And that is the uses of ecological principles to develop methods of returning degraded areas to the natural state. So on one hand, you've got a kind of got like a proactive thing. Conservation biology is sort of proactive, right? Like, hey, let's see what we can do to prevent this from happening. And then restoration ecology, in a sense, is reactive. It's like, all right, well, we've done this. How do we fix it? And that's what we'll talk about. Really quickly, we'll talk about biodiversity hotspots. And Thornabar, I know you've done a lot of videos, so you may have already been familiar with this because some of the videos talk about ecological hotspots. But let's talk about them really quickly. Conservation biologists that are applying the understanding of population and community and ecosystem dynamics in establishing parks, wilderness areas, and other legally protective nature reserves. So what we're saying here is that, you know, when we have nature reserves like the Cranberry Glades, which is a local thing in West Virginia, I took a picture of it for that reason. It's not like someone just said, okay, let's just take this area of land and, you know, just say this is a reserve now, right, and leave it alone. Sometimes they do that, but very often we use the science that you've been learning for the past 2 chapters to maintain these places. Now, when they do this, a lot of times they actually focus on something called a biodiversity hotspot. And that is an important word. And if this was going to be on the exam, you know, if this section would be, that question definitely would be. But a biodiversity hotspot is a relatively small area that has a large number of endangered and threatened species and a high concentration of endemic species. And what is an endemic species? It's a species found nowhere else. So when you think about a biodiversity hotspot, it's a very fragile spot. Why is it fragile? Because it has species that you can find nowhere else, and it has a lot of endangered and threatened species. Oh, have I given a word yet for attendance?
No.
I shouldn't have asked you that because now whoever's watching the video, well, it doesn't matter. Anyway, the first word for attendance is going to be speaker. Like, you know, someone talking or the thing that is playing your music, speaker. Anyway, so that's what a hotspot is, the spot that has endemic species, endangered, threatened species. And then your book actually shows you where the hottest of the hotspots are around the world. And you can see, you know, where they are. But I would talk on. We could go on and on about that. But I do think I have a video for independent work out there that talks about Madagascar. That is one of the more famous biological hotspots. But anyway, any question about what a hotspot is? A biological hotspot, excuse me.
No.
Okay, let's talk about conservation at the ecosystem level. Again, conservation biology aims at sustaining biodiversity, right? That is the goal of conservation biology. Again, biodiversity is the big thing. Without biodiversity, we don't have ecosystems, and without ecosystems, we don't have life. So when we're talking about biodiversity, obviously we want to sustain biodiversity in communities. We want to which we've already talked about. We want to sustain the biodiversity in ecosystems, which we've already talked about. But we also want to sustain them in landscapes. And that is the new term. We haven't talked about landscapes. What is an ecosystem? Well, it's kind of like the step up from, a landscape is like a step up from an ecosystem. So remember, population, a group of one species interacting, right? Community, a group of a bunch of species interacting. Ecosystems, you're looking at the species interacting plus the abiotic factors. And then the step up from that is landscapes. So landscape would be basically you're looking at a bunch of different ecosystems. So if you look at our area of West Virginia, you know, the landscape might be the forest ecosystem, and then the river ecosystem, and then the urban ecosystem in Charleston. You know, all those different ecosystems together that have all these different functions and do all these different things and thrive under different conditions. That's called a landscape. So it kind of goes back to that idea of biological diversity, but now instead of just having different species, we're talking about different types of ecosystems, and that's a good thing to have. And that's what landscape ecology is. That is the application of ecological principles to study land use patterns, basically. So again, the goal here is to make conservation a functional part of planning for land use. Because again, all these things interact with each other. It gets more complicated. Each step you go, from communities to ecosystems, from ecosystems to landscapes, it becomes more complicated. Your book also points out that the edges between ecosystems are prominent features of landscapes, whether natural or altered by people. And I'll show you what I mean with a picture here on the next slide. And they have their own physical conditions, such as soil type and surface structures. For example, The river is its own ecosystem, right? Like, think about that. Fish, you got aquatic things that live in the Kanawha River that don't live in the Kanawha State Forest, and vice versa, right? You have things that live on those mountains that don't live in the river. Those are two distinct ecosystems. However, if you just think of a river and then think of the riverbed, there's also things that live right there in that border between the water and the forest that don't live necessarily in the water or in the forest. They live right there at that border, and that would be the edges between ecosystems. But your book gives this example. Here you have a forest ecosystem. Here you have a grassland ecosystem. Here you have a river ecosystem, right? Oh, wow. There you have an oceanic ecosystem. I've never noticed that before. So all these different ecosystems. And, all the things that live in this forest and these forests, that's one ecosystem. But I bet the things that live right here on that border are different than what lives in that forest than what lives in that grassland. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so it's not just the ecosystems, but it's also that borderline between them that is also unique. Anyway, so this left picture is an example of natural edges, and then, of course, you have similar situations with man-made stuff. So, again, we have forest, which is natural, and then there's grassland. It's still a grassland, even though humans did it. Humans cut down those trees and maintain it, but it's still forest to grassland. And then here, instead of having a river, we have roads. So, again, the borders between ecosystems, whether it be natural or man-made. Which brings us to a different concept, something called a movement corridor. That is and I'm going to show you a picture of this on the next slide. So I'm going to go through this quickly. It's a narrow strip or a series of small clumps of habitat that connect otherwise isolated patches of natural habitat. And this is a good thing in a way because it can promote dispersal. So it can help plants and things migrate. Of course, it can also help diseases migrate too. So dispersal could be a bad thing. But generally, it's a good thing. It helps sustain populations. There we go. There's one example. So that's a natural bridge. What you can't see here is that that's not a road. That is actually just land, right? So anything that lived on this side of the road that needed to get on that side of the road, it can do it now, right? It's a little bit easier without becoming roadkill. And then here is another example of it. So let's just say right here where you can't see at the bottom, let's just say this area also looks like this, right? So you have a mountainous forest area right here where we are. Maybe we're standing on a mountain. And then way off in the distance is another mountain forested area. And in between us is a bunch of farmland. Well, this right here would be a corridor, right? So all the things, and it might not make sense. It might not be common sense to think about this, but some animals and plants need that. Like you might think a bird would just fly from where we are and just flutter its way over there. But some birds just simply won't do that. Some birds need to fly through brush, right? Because that provides them cover and concealment. And maybe they just won't move without that corridor. But I could go on, but I won't. But does this make sense? You can see the corridors between different ecosystems.
Yes.
All right. We're almost there. So let's talk about restoring ecosystems. This one's more important, I guess, more relevant for West Virginians because this is something that we deal with more in our state. Not necessarily bioremediation, but let's talk about it anyway. Bioremediation is when we use living organic organisms to detoxify polluted ecosystems. So this is something that you would find a lot of after an oil spill, right? So you might use bacteria because some bacteria actually do eat, if you will, oil. So they would be used to clean up an oil spill. Also, and this one's more relevant to West Virginia, there are plants that remove toxins out of soils. So after we have a coal mine, or, after we mine someplace for coal, very often what we leave behind is toxic soil. But there are certain species of plants that do a great job of removing those toxins. And there's a picture of this guy. I think that's goldenrod. I don't know. It doesn't matter. He's with whatever type of plant that is, and that plant is good at removing toxins. If you read your book, I think this picture's from your book, and there's a caption, and you can see exactly what kind of plant that is and where it's planted and what kind of toxins it's removing. Maybe even get that guy's name. I don't know. Anyway, some projects, here we go. We're still talking about restoring ecosystems. Some projects have a broader goal of returning ecosystems to their natural state. So let me back up again really quickly. The last thing we just talked about was fixing a mistake that just happened. Oh, there's an oil spill. Oh, we, mined this area. So sometimes it's very specific. It's like, let's at least undo what we did, And then there's a bigger goal in some cases of completely getting it back to the way it used to be. And your book uses an example of the Kissimmee River in Florida. And I'm familiar with this because I'm from down there. The Kissimmee River used to be a very shallow, slow, meandering river that connected two lakes. But what happened is humans needed that. And they said, hey, this is a good idea. We need this waterway. Let's turn this into a canal so we can move stuff back and forth. That would be very useful for us. That happened about 60 years ago. And to do that, humans had to drain about 31,000 acres of wetland. And obviously, as you might imagine, that had a very significant negative impact on basically everything that lived there. Because anything that lives in a wetland is not, generally speaking, is not going to live in a grassland, right? Those are completely different ecosystems. So you basically just got rid of everything that was living there. But more recently, there was a restoration project that was started, and it involves removing the water-controlled structures. So in that area, there's dams, there's reservoirs, there's channel modifications, all these things to make sure that there's canals, or they're starting to remove those things. They're also filling in about 35 kilometers of the canal, and I'll show you a picture to show you what I mean, because that might not make sense, right? Like, well, why are you going to fill it in? Won't that get rid of the water? Yes and no, and you'll see what I mean when I show you the picture. Your book points out that the first phase of this was completed in 2004. It's actually been a while since I've checked up on this. I'm going to look it up when I'm done with this to see where they are, see how it's coming. But it started, it's helping. Again, this is what we're looking at. There's Lake Okeechobee, there's Lake Kissimmee, and then we have the Kissimmee, Florida that connects the two. And you can see here, this is where the canal used to be. Nice and straight and flat. And you can imagine anything that lives in the deep, flat, straight waters of a canal would be different than what would be living in these shallow, meandering rivers or flowing waters of a natural river. Any questions about that?
No.
All right, last one for the semester. And then I guess I'll give the other word too. The next word is box. Like you would put your Christmas gift in a box. So there we go. As the world population grows and becomes more affluent, demand increases for ecosystem services, or demands increase. And we already learned about this when we talked about ecological footprints, right? We said on one hand, we do have an issue with the population. We have way too many humans. But we also pointed out it isn't just the number of humans we have. It's the people like us, like me, like your typical American, because we use a lot of resources. What kind of resources? I don't know why your book felt the need to point it out, because you could just think of all the resources we use, but obviously the big ones. We need food to eat. We need wood for our shelter. We need water to drink and to wash our clothes and to flush our toilets, all that stuff, right? These are the things that we use. So with that in mind, the goal of sustainable development, and this is important. This is the big thing. This is like the big thing for my Bio 108 class here. The goal of sustainable development is to meet the needs of today. First of all, that's the most important part, right? We do need to feed ourselves. We do need places to live. We need to enjoy our lives, right? We're not saying let's just like live like cavemen. We need to be able to enjoy our lives, or just to live in general. But we also need to do it without limiting the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And that's the big important part. If we were just talking about living for today, it would be very easy, right? Mine all the coal you want, burn all the coal you want, fish all the fish you want, cut down all the trees you want. Like, what's it matter? In our lifetime, we could probably completely rape the earth and we might be fine in our lifetime. But that's not sustainable, because, again, if you cut down more trees than are growing, then eventually you're going to run out. You're dipping into your savings account. If you're catching more fish than are reproducing, they're not going to come back, right? You're dipping into your savings account. We talked about that earlier in the semester. So that's why this is so important. It's not just a tree hugger issue. It is a matter of survival. So sustainable development, to be able to reach this goal, to be able to survive, basically, this depends on continued research, right? So we need to keep learning. We need people to keep getting into these fields and learning things. It also depends on the application of that. So we don't just need to learn. We need to apply what we learn. And that's kind of what we're doing with this whole climate change thing, right? Like scientists are learning and saying, hey, this is a problem. We need to fix it. And then there's pushback. So that would be the application of ecological knowledge, right? We need to use what we learn. And then finally, and this is to me a big one for you guys because no one here is a biology major. And again, if you remember the first conversation we had on the first day of class, I talked about why get a bachelor's degree. What's the difference between a bachelor's degree and a trade degree? And the idea here is that you have a broad education, right? And you can learn about other things and you can think about other things, think critically, and have a background knowledge to where you can make educated decisions and form educated opinions. Well, that's what this comes back to, right? So when we're talking about sustainable development and all this research and all this knowledge that these scientists come up with and that I'm teaching you, well, we need to connect all this information with social sciences, right? So yeah, it's easy for a biologist to say, look, you need to quit burning coal. Well, a social scientist might say, look, I agree, but we can't just cut down. We just can't eliminate coal mines because then what's going to happen to all those coal mining communities in West Virginia? What's that going to do to society? What's that going to do to our economics? West Virginia's economy would collapse if we just cut off coal tomorrow. What's it going to do to humanities with all these people now out of a job and living, presumably they would be on welfare. We already have an opioid epidemic. Would it get worse? All these things that are not directly related to biology, but are interconnected, as is every subject that you should be learning when you're getting your bachelor's degree. So sustainable development aims to conserve biodiversity. Obviously, that's the big part. That's the easy part, right? Everyone understands that. It's like, yeah, we're tree huggers. Yeah, we're trying to save the whales, whatever. But it's also trying to improve the human condition. So it isn't just about save the trees, save the whales, right? We also want to make things better for humans. Or in some cases, just ensure that we can continue to survive, right? So because of that, public education, political commitment, and cooperation of nations is essential to success. And your book also points out that the awareness of our ability to alter our biosphere and jeopardize our own existence and the existence of other species may help us choose a path towards a sustainable future. In other words, saying all this information you're learning, it's not strictly an academic exercise. This is stuff that you need to know for us to survive and stuff that you need to apply in your everyday lives. And that's it. We are done for the semester.
All right.
Do you have any questions about what we just covered or anything in the semester or anything in general?
Not right now. Just the review. If we're going to do a review, could you email us and let us know the day and time?
Definitely. What I will do once I know when it'll be, I'll post it to Google Classroom. So yeah, and then from there you'll get an email from it. So yeah, I'll let you know. In a perfect world, I'll give you plenty of. Well, it's kind of hard. I don't want to say in a perfect world. I'm kind of torn. There's two things I have to balance. On one hand, the sooner we do it, the better, because then you have more time to study.
Right.
On the other hand, the more heads up you get, the more likely it'll be that you can actually come and participate. But so I'm balancing between those two things. I'm still waiting on any emails from any students who might say, I can do it, but I can't do it at this time, or I can do it, but I can only do it at this time. So that'll help me.
Right. I'm just going to leave my weekend open and be flexible. Yeah.
Awesome. And then for you and anyone else watching this video, the thing to keep in mind for this review, it'll be like most of them, except this time, instead of just looking at the study guides for chapters 13, 19, and 20, we're also going to look at exams 1, exam 2, and exam 3, because all that's, going to be on the final. So for anybody, for you and anyone else watching this, make sure you go through those study guides. Make sure you go through those old exams and take notes. Like, what question did you have problems with, or what do you want me to explain?
All righty.
All right. Well, I guess that's it from now. I'm going to go give my voice a break. My voice is tired.
I appreciate it.
See you sort of soonish.
All right. I appreciate you this semester too. You really worked hard working with us. Appreciate everything.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your hard work.
All right.
All right. See you soon.